The bullet that shattered the water trough missed Zachary Owens by 3 inches, and it changed the course of his entire life, because that was the moment Beatrice Kane looked up from her father's porch, and their eyes met across the dusty main street of Rawhide, Nevada. It was 1873, and Zachary had just turned 23, a ranch hand with nothing but a horse, a worn saddle, and dreams bigger than the Nevada sky. He had been leading his mare to the trough when the shot rang out, meant for a card cheat fleeing the saloon. The chaos erupted, fast, men shouting, horses rearing, the cheat scrambling into an alley, but Zachary stood frozen, staring at the girl on the porch of the biggest ranch house in town. Beatrice was 18, with hair the color of honey and eyes that held the depth of the mountain lakes he had seen up north. She wore a simple blue dress that the wind pressed against her frame, and her hand had flown to her throat in alarm when the shot fired. For 3 heartbeats, maybe 4, they simply looked at each other across that dusty expanse. Then her father, Samuel Kane, stepped out onto the porch and grabbed her arm, pulling her inside so roughly that Zachary felt anger flare in his chest. Samuel Kane owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. He had built his empire through ruthlessness and cunning, and everyone in Rawhide knew he ruled his household the same way he ruled his ranch. His wife had died 5 years prior, leaving Beatrice to navigate her father's iron will alone. Zachary told himself to forget what he had seen. He was nobody, working for $40 a month at the Double R Ranch, sleeping in a bunkhouse with 11 other men. He had no business thinking about Samuel Kane's daughter, but fate had other plans. 2 days later, he was in the general store buying tobacco when Beatrice entered with her father. Zachary stepped back immediately, making himself as unnoticeable as possible among the shelves of canned goods and fabric bolts. He watched her move through the store, her father's shadow following her every step. She looked at ribbons with longing but did not reach for them. She glanced at books but did not pick them up. Her father spoke to the shopkeeper about an order, his voice booming and domineering while Beatrice stood silent as a statue. Then she turned, and her eyes found Zachary between the shelves. Recognition sparked immediately. Her lips parted as if she might speak, and Zachary felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He took 1 step toward her. "Beatrice?" Samuel Kane's voice cracked like a whip. She jumped, the color draining from her face. "Come here. Now." She obeyed, but not before she looked back at Zachary one more time. And in that glance, he saw something that would haunt him for years, loneliness so profound, it made his chest ache. That evening, as Zachary sat on the bunkhouse steps watching the sun bleed red across the horizon, his friend Marcus told him the story everyone in Rawhide knew, but no one spoke about openly. "Samuel Kane keeps that girl locked up tighter than gold in a bank vault," Marcus said, whittling a piece of wood with his knife. "Ever since his wife died, he has gotten worse. Beatrice is not allowed to go anywhere without him. She is not allowed to speak to men. She is not allowed to have friends. He says it is to protect her reputation, but everyone knows it is because he cannot stand to lose control of anything, even his own daughter." "That is no way to live," Zachary said quietly. "No, it is not, but what can anyone do? He is Samuel Kane. He owns half this town. The sheriff eats dinner at his table twice a week." Marcus shook his head. "I heard he has already turned away 3 men who came asking to court her. Good men, too. Men with property and prospects. He told them all the same thing, that no man would ever be good enough for his daughter." Zachary felt something harden in his chest. He knew about powerful men who thought they could control the world. His own father had been that way, a bitter drunk who had ruled their small farm in Missouri with his fists until Zachary turned 16 and left for good. He had sworn then that he would never let anyone have that kind of power over him again, and he would never stand by while someone else was crushed under that same boot. "How old does she have to be before she can make her own choices?" Zachary asked. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "In the eyes of the law, she is already old enough. She is 18. But with a father like Samuel Kane, the law does not mean much. He will keep her under his thumb until he dies or until she finds the courage to run, and from what I have seen, she is too afraid to run." Zachary did not sleep well that night. He kept seeing Beatrice's eyes, kept seeing the way her father had yanked her inside like she was property instead of a person. By the time dawn broke, he had made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who knew the facts, but Zachary had never been one to choose the easy path. He would wait for her. He would make something of himself. He would become the kind of man who could stand up to Samuel Kane. And when the time was right, when she was free, he would come for her. The next Sunday, Zachary rode into town for church. He rarely attended services, but he knew the Kanes would be there. Sure enough, Samuel Kane sat in the front pew with Beatrice beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes downcast. Zachary took a seat 3 rows back where he could watch her without being obvious. After the service, as people filed out into the sunshine, Zachary positioned himself near the church steps. He did not approach Beatrice, did not even look directly at her, but as she passed with her father, he said just loud enough for her to hear, "Beautiful morning." It was not addressed to anyone in particular, just a comment to the air. But Beatrice heard it. Her step faltered for just a fraction of a second, and though she did not turn, he saw the smallest hint of a smile touch her lips. Samuel Kane noticed nothing. He was too busy talking to the banker about interest rates. That small victory sustained Zachary through the following weeks. He began attending church every Sunday, always sitting where Beatrice could see him if she chose to look, always offering some innocuous comment as she passed that could not possibly be construed as improper, but that he hoped would let her know she was not alone. "Fine weather we are having. The Reverend preached well today. That hymn was particularly lovely." He never looked at her when he spoke. He never gave Samuel Kane any reason to suspect the words were meant for his daughter, but Beatrice heard them, and gradually Zachary began to notice small changes. She held her head a little higher. The tightness around her mouth eased slightly. Once, just once, as she passed him, she whispered so softly he almost missed it, "Thank you." Those 2 words gave him hope, but hope was a dangerous thing in Rawhide, Nevada, in 1873. 3 months after that first meeting, Samuel Kane made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the community. He had arranged for Beatrice to marry Cyrus Thornton, a 50-year-old cattle buyer from California who had more money than sense, and a reputation for cruelty that made even hardened cowboys uncomfortable. Zachary heard the news in the saloon, where Marcus delivered it with the gravity of a death sentence. Kane announced it yesterday. The wedding is set for next spring when Beatrice turns 19. Thornton is paying him a fortune for the privilege. $30,000 and a partnership in his California operation. Zachary's hand tightened around his whiskey glass so hard he thought it might shatter. She agreed to this. She was not asked. Kane made the deal, and that is that. Marcus looked at him with something like pity. "I know you have been watching her, Zachary. Everyone knows. But you need to forget about her now. This is done." Zachary set down his glass very carefully and walked out of the saloon. He walked through the dark streets of Rawhide until he reached the edge of town where the Kane Ranch began, marked by a whitewashed fence that stretched as far as the eye could see. He stood there in the moonlight, hands clenched at his sides, and made a promise to himself and to the girl trapped somewhere beyond that fence. He would not let this happen. 1 year. He had 1 year to change everything. The next morning, Zachary went to his boss at the Double R Ranch and asked for extra work. He took on every job no one else wanted, breaking the wildest horses, mending fence in the brutal Nevada heat, driving cattle through mountain passes that scared most men. He worked 16-hour days and saved every penny he could. He stopped drinking, stopped gambling, stopped spending money on anything except absolute necessities. His body grew harder, stronger. His reputation grew too. Men began to respect him for his work ethic and his skill with horses. By the end of that first year, he had saved $300 and had been promoted to foreman. It was not enough. Not nearly enough to stand equal to Samuel Kane. But it was a start. He still went to church every Sunday. He still watched Beatrice from his pew, though now there was a desperate quality to his vigil. She looked paler, thinner. The life seemed to be draining out of her week by week. Sometimes he would see her staring at nothing, her eyes empty, and he wanted to storm into the Kane house and carry her away by force. But that would only make things worse. Samuel Kane would have him arrested, possibly killed. Beatrice would be married off even faster, sent away where Zachary could never find her. No, he had to be smart. He had to be patient. 4 months before the wedding, Cyrus Thornton came to town to visit his future bride. Zachary saw them together once, walking down the main street with Samuel Kane between them like a warden. Thornton was a thick, red-faced man who looked at Beatrice the way a man might look at a horse. He was considering purchasing, evaluating her worth, finding her acceptable. Beatrice walked with her head down, her shoulders hunched, and Zachary felt something inside him crack. That night, he did something reckless. He rode to the Kane ranch and left a note tucked into the fence post nearest the main house, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the weather. He did not sign it, but he hoped she would know who it was from. The note said simply, "Do not give up hope. Someone is fighting for you. Someone will always fight for you." He did not know if she ever found it. He never saw any sign. But 2 weeks later, during church, when Samuel Kane was distracted by a conversation with the mayor, Beatrice turned in her pew and looked directly at Zachary. Her eyes were brimming with tears, but she mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." It was the most they had communicated in over a year, and it had to be enough. The wedding loomed closer. Zachary worked himself to the bone, saved every penny, and made plans that probably would not work, but were all he had. He thought about asking her to run away with him, but where would they go? Samuel Kane had connections everywhere. He would hunt them down, and when he found them, Beatrice would face consequences Zachary did not want to imagine. Then, 6 weeks before the wedding, everything changed. Zachary was in town buying supplies when he saw Samuel Kane storm out of the bank, his face purple with rage. Behind him, the bank manager looked shaken. Within hours, rumors were flying through Rawhide like wildfire. Samuel Kane had made a series of disastrous investments in a railroad venture that had turned out to be fraudulent. He had lost over $100,000. He was not ruined, his ranch was still valuable, but he was severely weakened, and everyone in town knew it. More importantly, the balance of power had shifted. Samuel Kane was no longer untouchable. 2 weeks later, Cyrus Thornton sent a telegram calling off the wedding. Without the promise of a partnership in a thriving operation, he had no interest in marrying a girl from a struggling ranch, no matter how pretty she was. Samuel Kane tried to salvage the arrangement, even offered to lower the bride price, but Thornton was done. Beatrice was free. Or at least, freer than she had been. Zachary knew this was his moment. He could not wait any longer. He had $400 saved, a solid reputation, and the respect of every rancher in the county. It still was not enough to match what Samuel Kane had been, but it might be enough to match what Samuel Kane was now, a man whose empire was crumbling, who needed alliances instead of enemies. On a cold morning in November 1874, Zachary rode up to the Kane ranch house and knocked on the door. Samuel Kane himself answered, looking older and harder than he had a year ago. "What do you want?" Kane demanded. "I want to speak to you about your daughter, sir." For a moment, Zachary thought Kane might shoot him right there on the porch. The older man's hand actually moved toward the gun on his hip, but then something changed in his expression. Calculation replaced rage. "You are that foreman from the Double R," Kane said slowly. "Owens, right?" "Yes, sir. Zachary Owens." "What makes you think you have any right to speak to me about my daughter?" Zachary met his gaze steadily. "Because I have watched her suffer for 2 years. Because I have waited while she was spoken for. Because I love her, and I think she deserves better than to be sold to the highest bidder." Samuel Kane's eyes narrowed. "You love her. You have never even spoken to her properly." "No, sir, I have not, because you made it impossible, but I have watched her. I have seen her kindness and her strength. I have seen how she endures what no person should have to endure. And I am asking you now formally for permission to court her. You have nothing to offer her. You are a ranch hand. I am a foreman. I make $75 a month. I have $400 saved. I own my horse and my tack free and clear. I have the respect of every man I work with. I know it is not much compared to what you wanted for her, but it is honest, and it is earned, and I swear to you on everything I hold sacred that I will spend the rest of my life making her happy." Kane stared at him for a long time. Zachary could practically see the thoughts moving behind those hard eyes, weighing options, calculating advantages. "You know, my financial situation is not what it was," Kane said finally, his voice bitter. "I know you have had setbacks, sir. I need alliances now more than enemies. The Double R Ranch has been pushing to buy my western grazing lands. If I had a connection there, a family connection through my daughter, perhaps." Zachary understood immediately what Kane was implying. He hated that Beatrice was still being used as a bargaining chip, but he also knew this was the only way Kane would agree. "My boss thinks highly of me, sir. If I were to become your son-in-law, I believe I could convince him that an alliance between your operations would be beneficial for everyone." It was not quite a lie, but it was not quite the truth either. Zachary had no idea if his boss would care about such things. But he could see Kane considering it, could see the gears turning. "I will think about it," Kane said finally. "Come back tomorrow." Zachary left, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. That night he could not eat, could not sleep. He paced the bunkhouse until Marcus threatened to tie him to his bunk. The next day, Zachary rode back to the Kane ranch. This time, Samuel Kane invited him inside. They sat in a parlor filled with expensive furniture that now seemed like relics of a fading empire, and Kane laid out his terms. "You may court Beatrice. Supervised visits, twice a week, here at the ranch. If after 6 months you both still wish to marry, I will give my consent. In exchange, you will use your influence at the Double R to facilitate a partnership regarding my western lands. And if Beatrice does not wish to be courted by me," Zachary asked, because he had to know that this was her choice, not just another deal made over her head. For the first time, something like respect flickered in Samuel Kane's eyes. "Then the arrangement ends and you will not bother us again." "Agreed." Kane stood and walked to the door of the parlor. "Beatrice, come here." Zachary's heart jumped into his throat. He heard footsteps on the stairs, light and hesitant. And then she appeared in the doorway, and even though he had seen her every Sunday for 2 years, Having her this close, in the same room, made the air rush out of his lungs. She was beautiful. Not in the polished way of town ladies, but in a raw, real way that made his hands shake. Her honey-colored hair was pulled back simply, and her dress was plain calico, but her eyes, those eyes that had haunted him, were fixed on him with an expression he could not quite read. Fear, hope, both. Beatrice, Samuel Kane said, his voice oddly formal, this is Zachary Owens. He has asked permission to court you. I have granted it, contingent on your agreement. Do you wish to be courted by this man? Beatrice looked at her father, then at Zachary. Her hands were clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles were white. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You are the man from church, the one who speaks to the air. Despite everything, despite the tension crackling in the room, Zachary felt a smile tug at his lips. Yes, madam, I am. Why? She asked, and there was such vulnerability in that single word that Zachary wanted to cross the room and take her hand, but he knew he could not. Not yet. Because you looked like you needed to hear a kind word, because no one should be as alone as you seemed, because... He paused, then decided to hell with caution. If he was going to do this, he was going to do it honestly. Because from the moment I first saw you, I have not been able to stop thinking about you. Color flooded her cheeks. Samuel Kane cleared his throat disapprovingly, but he did not interrupt. I do not know you, Beatrice said, but there was something in her voice, not rejection, but wonder, as if the concept of being able to choose something for herself was so foreign she did not know how to process it. No, madam, you do not. That is why I am asking to court you. So we can know each other, so you can decide for yourself if I am someone you could care about. He took a breath. But I want you to know there is no pressure. If you say no, I will walk out that door and never bother you again. This is your choice, Beatrice. Yours. Tears filled her eyes. She looked at her father as if expecting him to tell her what to say, but for once, Samuel Kane remained silent. Finally, she looked back at Zachary. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I would like that. The next 6 months were the longest and the shortest of Zachary's life. He came to the Kane ranch every Wednesday and Sunday evening, and they sat in the parlor under the watchful eye of Samuel Kane, or his housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Grayson, who sat in the corner knitting and listening to every word they said. At first, their conversations were stilted, awkward. Beatrice barely spoke above a whisper, and she seemed afraid to express any opinion that might be contradicted. But Zachary was patient. He asked her about small things, what books she liked, what she thought of the weather, if she enjoyed music. Gradually, bit by bit, she began to open up. She loved poetry, especially Wordsworth. She played piano but had not been allowed to play in years because her father said it gave him headaches. She loved the smell of rain and the way the desert looked in early morning light. She had once wanted to learn to ride horses properly, not just side saddle on supervised trails, but really ride. My mother used to tell me stories about when she was young, Beatrice said one evening, her voice soft with memory. She grew up on a ranch in Texas, and she could ride as well as any man. She could rope cattle and shoot straight, and she was not afraid of anything. My father loved that about her back then. But after they married, he changed, or maybe she did, I do not know. But by the time I was old enough to remember clearly, she was quiet and sad, and she never rode anymore. What happened to her? Zachary asked gently. Influenza 5 years ago, but I think part of her was already gone long before that. I think she just gave up. Beatrice looked at him with eyes that held too much understanding. I do not want to end up like her. I do not want to disappear. You will not, Zachary said firmly. I promise you, Beatrice, you will not. As the weeks turned into months, something beautiful began to happen. Beatrice started to laugh. At first it was just small smiles, but eventually, When Zachary told her about a particularly stubborn horse he had been trying to break, or when he described Marcus's terrible singing during cattle drives, she would laugh, a real, genuine sound that made his heart soar. She started expressing opinions too. She told him she thought Shakespeare was overrated and that people should read more contemporary poetry. She said she believed women should have the right to vote, something Samuel Cain would have been scandalized to hear. She admitted she hated tea but loved coffee, and that she sometimes snuck into the kitchen late at night to make herself a cup because her father insisted tea was more proper for ladies. And Zachary fell more in love with her every single day. He told her about his own life, too, about growing up in Missouri, about his father's cruelty, about leaving home with nothing and making his way west. He told her about his dreams of one day owning his own small ranch, nothing grand like her father's empire, but something that was his, earned through his own work. "I would like that," Beatrice said quietly one evening. "Something small and ours, where we could just be ourselves." The "we" in that sentence made Zachary's breath catch. They were not allowed to touch, not beyond a formal handshake when he arrived and departed. But there were moments when their eyes would meet across the parlor, and the connection between them was so intense it was almost physical. There were evenings when Zachary would be talking, and he would lose his train of thought completely, because Beatrice was looking at him with such tenderness that words became impossible. Samuel Cain watched it all with calculating eyes. True to Zachary's promise, he had approached his boss about a potential partnership with the Kane Ranch, and negotiations were underway. Kane's financial situation was stabilizing, but slowly, and he clearly saw Beatrice's marriage to Zachary as a strategic advantage. Zachary hated that aspect of it, hated that their love was tangled up in business deals and property lines. But he also knew it was the price of admission to Beatrice's life, and he would pay it gladly. In March of 1875, as winter began loosening its grip on Nevada, Zachary asked Beatrice to marry him. It was a Sunday evening, and they were in the parlor as always, with Mrs. Grayson knitting in her corner. Zachary had been planning an elaborate speech, something romantic and poetic that would express everything he felt, but when the moment came, all of that disappeared. "Beatrice," he said simply, "I love you. I have loved you since the day a bullet missed me and I looked up and saw you standing on that porch. I will love you until the day I die. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling, truly smiling, in a way he had never seen before. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, Zachary, I will marry you." Mrs. Grayson actually stopped knitting, a smile softening her stern features. Samuel Cain, who had been informed this was coming, entered the parlor and gave his formal blessing, though his expression remained hard. They were married 6 weeks later, in April of 1875, in the same church where Zachary had watched Beatrice for 2 years. It was a small ceremony. Some people from town, the men from the Double R Ranch, a few of the Kane Ranch hands. Beatrice wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and she looked like something out of a dream. When the Reverend said Zachary could kiss his bride, he cupped her face gently in his hands and kissed her for the first time, and it felt like coming home after a long journey through hostile territory. They moved into a small house on the Double R Ranch property, provided by Zachary's boss as part of his compensation as foreman. It was not much: 3 rooms, a stone fireplace, a porch that needed fixing, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. The first night in their new home, Beatrice stood in the middle of the main room looking around with wonder. "I can hardly believe this is real," she said softly. "That I am here, that I am free." Zachary came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "You are free," he murmured into her hair. "And you are loved, so deeply loved, Beatrice." She turned in his arms and kissed him, and it was different from the chaste kiss at the church. This was deeper, full of promise and passion and all the feelings they had kept contained for so long. That night they made love for the first time, and it was tender and awkward and perfect. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the moonlight streaming through the window, and Beatrice cried. But when Zachary asked if he had hurt her, she shook her head. "These are happy tears," she said, laughing through them. "I did not know I could feel this happy. I did not know it was possible." They built a life together in that little house. Beatrice learned to cook, burning more meals than she successfully made at first, but laughing at her failures instead of being afraid of them. Zachary taught her to ride the way she had always wanted to, and soon she was galloping across the rangeland with her hair flying behind her, whooping with joy. She started playing piano again, too. Zachary bought her an old upright from a family moving back east, and she would play for hours, making up for all the years of silence. Sometimes Zachary would come home from a long day of work to find her at the keys, completely absorbed in the music, and he would just stand in the doorway watching her, marveling that this beautiful, vibrant woman was his wife. Their relationship with Samuel Kane remained complicated. He visited occasionally, his manner still gruff and controlling, though he seemed to have accepted that Beatrice was no longer under his power. The partnership between the Kane Ranch and the Double R had gone through, stabilizing Kane's finances, and while he never thanked Zachary directly, there was a grudging respect in his eyes that had not been there before. In the summer of 1876, Beatrice told Zachary she was pregnant. He spun her around in their little kitchen, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. That winter, during a cold snap that froze the water in the basin and turned the desert white with frost, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Daniel, after Zachary's grandfather, the only member of his family he remembered with fondness. Holding his son for the first time, looking at Beatrice exhausted but radiant in their bed, Zachary felt a wave of emotion so powerful it brought him to his knees beside her. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure if he was talking to Beatrice or to whatever force in the universe had brought them together. "Thank you." Being a father changed something in Zachary. He became even more determined to provide for his family, to build something lasting. He continued working as foreman at the Double R, but he also started buying cattle of his own, just a few head at first, running them with the ranch's herd under an arrangement with his boss. Beatrice proved to be a natural mother, but she did not disappear into motherhood the way some women did. She still rode, taking Daniel with her in a sling once he was old enough. She still played piano, sometimes with Daniel propped on her lap, his tiny hands banging on the keys. She had opinions about everything from ranch management to politics, and she was not afraid to share them. "You know what I love most about you," Zachary said one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Daniel asleep in Beatrice's arms. "You are exactly who you were meant to be, not who your father wanted you to be, not who society says you should be. Just you, completely and perfectly yourself." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I could not be that person without you. You gave me the freedom to become myself." "No," Zachary said firmly. "You were always that person, Beatrice. I just gave you the space to let it show." They had their struggles, of course. Money was tight sometimes, and the work was endless. There were droughts that killed cattle and winters that were brutal. There were arguments about how to spend their savings, about whether to take risks or play it safe, about 100 small decisions that make up a life. But they always came back to each other. They always talked it through, always chose to love each other even when it was hard. In 1878, their second child was born, a daughter they named Clara, after Beatrice's mother. Samuel Kane came to see his granddaughter, and something in him seemed to soften when he held her. He looked at Beatrice, really looked at her, and said quietly, "Your mother would have been proud of you." It was not an apology for all the years of control and isolation, but it was something, and Beatrice accepted it with grace. By 1879, 5 years after they married, Zachary had saved enough to buy a small piece of land adjoining the Double R. It was not much, 80 acres with a creek running through it, but it was theirs. They built a new house together, bigger than their first home, with Zachary doing most of the construction work himself with help from his friends at the ranch. The day they moved in, Beatrice stood on the porch of their new home, holding Clara on her hip while Daniel ran around the yard chasing chickens, and she cried. "Happy tears again?" Zachary asked, coming up beside her. "Always happy tears with you," she said, kissing him. "Do you remember that day when the bullet missed you and you looked up and saw me? I remember every detail. I saw you too, you know, and I thought, who is that man who stands so tall even when someone is shooting at him? I thought, I wish I could be that brave. I wish I could talk to someone like that." She smiled. "I never imagined I would end up here with you with all of this." "I waited 5 years," Zachary said softly. "From the day I first saw you until the day we married. 5 years of watching and hoping and fighting to be worthy of you. And I would wait 50 more if I had to, because you are worth every moment, Beatrice. You are worth everything." She kissed him then, long and deep, while their children played around them and the sun set over their land, their home, their life together. Samuel Kane died in 1881, his health having declined rapidly after a fall from his horse. He left the majority of his estate to Beatrice, who divided it among the ranch hands who had worked for her father for decades and a trust for her children. She kept only a small portion for herself and Zachary, enough to expand their herd and secure their future. "He tried to control me until the very end," Beatrice said, reading the will that attempted to dictate how she should use the inheritance. "But I am not his to control anymore. I have not been for a long time." By 1883, the Owens Ranch was thriving. They had nearly 200 head of cattle, 3 horses, a barn full of hay, and a growing reputation for quality stock. Zachary had hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, and Beatrice managed the books and correspondence, proving to have a keen head for business. They had 4 children by then, Daniel at 7, Clara at 5, and twin boys named Matthew and Thomas, who had been born in 1882, and who kept everyone constantly exhausted and entertained in equal measure. One evening, after the children were finally asleep, Zachary and Beatrice sat on their porch watching the stars come out. It was something they still did regularly, even after nearly a decade of marriage, finding time to just be together, to remember where they started and appreciate where they had arrived. "You ever think about how different life could have been?" Beatrice asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "If you had not been standing by that water trough the day the bullet missed you, if you had not kept coming to church, if you had given up." "I think about it sometimes," Zachary admitted. "And then I stop, because thinking about a life without you and the children is too painful to bear." "My father used to tell me that love was weakness," Beatrice said quietly. "He said that letting someone matter to you gave them power over you, and that was dangerous. I believed him for so long. But he was wrong, Zachary. Love is not weakness. Love is what gave me the strength to survive all those years. Love is what made me brave enough to say yes when you asked to court me. Love is what makes everything possible." Zachary turned to look at her, this woman who had been a silent, frightened girl on a porch when he first saw her, and who had become a force of nature, a loving mother, a brilliant partner, a woman who rode across the rangeland with her head high and fear in her rearview mirror. "I love you," he said simply, because after all these years, after all they had built together, those were still the most important words he knew. "I love you too," she said. "I will love you until the stars fall from the sky and the desert turns to ocean. I will love you beyond this life and into whatever comes next." They sat together as the night deepened around them, two people who had fought against incredible odds to find each other, to build something real and lasting in the harsh beauty of the Nevada desert. Behind them, their children slept safely in the home they had built. Around them, their land stretched out under the infinite sky. And between them, love the kind that endures, that transforms, that makes everything worthwhile. Years later, when Daniel was grown with children of his own, he would ask his parents to tell him the story of how they met. Zachary and Beatrice would sit together, their hands still automatically finding each other after decades of marriage, and they would tell him about a bullet that missed, about eyes meeting across a dusty street, about forbidden words whispered in church, about waiting and hoping and refusing to give up. "Your mother was forbidden to speak to me," Zachary would say, his voice still full of wonder even after all those years. "So I waited, 5 years until she was free, and it was worth every single moment." "It was not really 5 years," Beatrice would always correct him, squeezing his hand. "It was from the first moment I saw you until the day we married. 2 years of watching across church pews, 6 months of supervised courtship, and then forever together. And your father is right, it was worth every moment of waiting, every moment of fear, every moment of doubt. Because love that has to fight to exist is love that knows its own worth." Their children and grandchildren would listen to this story many times over the years, and each time they told it, it ended the same way, with Zachary and Beatrice looking at each other with the same love and wonder that had brought them together all those years ago in Rawhide, Nevada, when a cowboy with nothing but hope looked across a dusty street and saw his entire future in the eyes of a rancher's daughter who was forbidden to speak to him. They lived long lives together, growing old on their ranch, watching their children and grandchildren thrive. When Beatrice died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72, with Zachary holding her hand, her last words were, "Thank you for waiting for me." Zachary followed her less than 6 months later, as if his body simply could not remember how to exist without her. He died in the same bed, in the house they built together, surrounded by the family they created, with Beatrice's name on his lips. Their descendants kept the ranch running for generations, and the story of how Zachary and Beatrice found each other became the stuff of family legend, a tale of patience and courage and love that refused to be denied, even by the most impossible circumstances. It was a reminder that sometimes the best things in life are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. And in the small cemetery on the edge of their property, under 2 trees that had grown together until their branches were completely intertwined, 2 headstones stood side by side. On one was written, "Zachary Owens, 1850–1922, he waited." On the other, "Beatrice Kane Owens, 1855–1927. She was worth waiting for." Between them, planted by their children, a rose bush bloomed every spring without fail, red as the desert sunset, fragrant as hope, enduring as the love story that had begun with a bullet that missed and a glance across a dusty street that changed 2 lives forever.